we're talking about Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn happens to be one of my favorite historical figures, and which is something I have in common with this friend. And she just finished reading a book, a historical novel about Anne Boleyn. We were talking about how Anne Boleyn's life was recently enough that you would think we would have better records about her life. And when you look at history in general, you see that there are a lot of gaps where you wouldn't expect there to be. And fairly recent history, like within the past 2 centuries. You look at the debates that surround the religious opinions of our founding fathers of this country, and you would think that this would have been very well documented, and in some cases it is. That doesn't stop people from trying to say that what they actually meant was this, or they actually meant was that, or that they were actually this faith, or this denomination, or that denomination. It's a topic of quite a bit of debate. And you would think we would have a better record of what actually was the case. Even looking at the history of the Pledge of Allegiance, which didn't have the phrase "under God" in it until the 1950s. When it was first written by a minister, no less, it didn't have those words. And it went through half a dozen revisions before we ended up with what we have today. But that's a part of our history that people like to kind of ignore and conveniently forget, and then get all up in arms when people want to revert back to the original version without "under God." And I mean, it was written by a Baptist minister, for crying out loud, or pastor, or whatever they call themselves. You would think if somebody was going to think that "under God" was an important part of the Pledge of Allegiance, it would have been a Baptist minister, and he would have included it in the original, which he did not. So during this conversation, we kept expanding our view of history and looking at facts that we can't even get straight about things that happened in the last decade. And all of the gaps in our history, our historical record of the past century and the past 5 centuries. Who's to say that the information we have from 2, 3, 4 millennia ago, that people are making important life decisions using that information, who's to say that any of that is accurate? Who's to say that there aren't gaps in that? Who's to say that that is an accurate historical record? And we agreed that neither one of us saw that as an accurate historical record. Hadn't before this conversation, but it just seemed that it led that this conversation and looking at the way history works, that taking an ancient text as truth, as a complete story, just seems illogical. That there are plenty of spaces where there's missing information or conflicting information. How are we to determine what part is true, what part is not, and what lies between? So all of this, the gaps in history, the poor historical record that we have from even the current century, let alone previous centuries, how can we, in all good faith, take a book that's 2,000 to 5,000 years old and take it as inerrant and true and complete and accurate? Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Thanks for joining me for Sacrilegious Sunday. I'll see you tomorrow for Mom Monday. Bye.